In today's video, we'll walk through setting up a workflow. We'll discuss workflow creation, trigger setup, workflow design, and basic troubleshooting tips. In our scenario, we need to set up a workflow to pull data from SFTP. Let's begin. First, we'll open the project, which will bring us to the Manage Workflows page. We'll add our new workflow using the Add button on the upper right, then provide a name and description. If we wanted to copy an existing workflow, we can do so here. Instead, we're going to save a blank workflow using the Save button. Now that the workflow's been created, we can configure it. When we open the workflow, we land on the Workflow Settings page. Initially, these settings are fine to leave as default. Once the workflow design is finalized, these settings can be updated. They include settings like notifications, how messages are handled, like whether or not to retry failures automatically, and other advanced options. This is also where workflow variables can be configured. Once completed, variables can be included in workflow actions and mappings. Examples include default options, like currencies or tax codes, or settings that can be used in multiple places in a workflow. Because this is a blank workflow, we'll need to set up the trigger. Workflow triggers are responsible for fetching the data from a vendor and initiating the workflow logic. Trigger settings vary depending on the connector and source selected, so while the general setup process is the same, some of the options will vary. Starting from the top, the connector settings section defines where the data comes from. The connector defines the vendor that's used. In this case, we're fetching a file from SFTP, so we'll pick the SFTP connector. The connection config defines where we're connecting. For example, what SFTP host, or more generally, which third-party system we need to connect to. Configs can be added to the project settings screen, or from here using the plus button to the right. Next, we'll pick the source, which defines what data we're capturing from the specified system. In this case, we want to load a file and its data, so we'll pick the Get File option. Once we've configured the connector settings section, we need to define the source settings. The first option available to all sources is the ID path. This allows us to extract a user-friendly ID from the message itself, such as an order ID or customer number. We haven't generated a sample yet, so we'll circle back to this option once we've run a workflow test. Other options in this section allow data to be filtered down, keeping the trigger focused on what it needs to complete the workflow. In the case of SFTP, a required setting is the path to the file, and in our case, we're using an optional filter to provide a file name to get exactly one file from the source. Connectors for other vendors support filters based on date, object type, transaction type, and so on. Reference documentation with examples can be found on our help site, help.saltbox.io. Go to the reference section and select the connector you're interested in. Now that we've loaded the basic filters, we'll go ahead and set the message format settings. For our case, we're using SFTP to open an XML file, so we'll select that from the message format dropdown. The option XPath to contained messages allows us to break data collections into multiple messages. In this case, our source file will have a collection of 20 objects, so we'll set the path to /root/course. This is something that can be found in the data itself, which we'll walk through shortly. Finally, we'll set the schedule. In our case, this is a work in progress, so we'll leave this set to manual. When the workflow is ready, a schedule can be set to automate the trigger. We'll go ahead and hit save when our trigger options are complete. The trigger defines what data is given to the workflow, so now we need to define how to handle that data via Workflow Designer. You can see here that because we started with a blank workflow, the only thing we have is an empty branch. Branches act as a way to group related actions together and include simple branches like the one shown, as well as conditional branches, if or if-else, and for each loops. To get started, the first thing we need to do is to generate sample data. This will allow us to build up more complex logic. First, we're going to pull in a placeholder action from the core connector. Then we'll save and run the workflow. When a workflow is saved, you're prompted to enter check-in comments. This allows you to iterate through a design and roll back to a previous version, should you need to do so. Let's give a basic description here. To be able to run a workflow, the engine needs to be running, so I'll go ahead and get this started. Generally speaking, when a change is made to a workflow's advanced settings, trigger schedule settings for example, the engine will need to be restarted again. Now we can run the workflow to generate our first sample data. We can use this to build out more advanced options like the visual data mapper, ID path, and so on. We'll hit Run, which will run the trigger and pull in filtered data. In this case, we're pulling in 20 messages from one file. We've run the workflow, but because the only action is a placeholder, the message was successful. However, the reason for running the workflow at this point is to generate sample data that we can use. We can pull this information from the status section. Expand the status section using the plus sign. This will show us the workflow message. If you need to explore the original sample data, for example, if the source was JSON or CSV format, you could view that using the raw message.xml. To view the message as handled by the workflow, which is what we're interested in, open up the message.xml link and save a copy to the workflow. We're going to save this as a file in our samples folder. Now that we have sample files which contain the data structure, we're going to go back to the trigger and add a friendly ID to the workflow. On the workflow trigger page, scroll down to the ID path field, use the Add button on the right, and press the Select Sample button. Expand the folder where the file was saved, and double-click. These files are all contained within the workflow. Select the field that best represents the data. There may be multiple options to choose from. Apply, and save. Reopen the Workflow Designer to run the workflow again. Now we can see a friendly ID, loaded from the data itself instead of a randomly generated one. This can be used to quickly identify a message when troubleshooting. At this point, the workflow is set up and ready for design and mapping. For more walkthrough videos and tutorials, visit help.saltbox.io.